Will.
Okay. All right. How's everyone doing?
Good.
Good.
It's been a couple weeks since we've been together with Easter and Palm Sunday, so it's good to be back into this routine of reading through the Bible. We are in week 17 of this Bible read through, this gathering together around God's Word. And for the next week, we'll be reading 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and so we're going to talk about that today. And I'll give a little background on it, and we'll have a discussion specifically looking at the temple and the role of worship in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now, 1st and 2nd Chronicles is a ton of material. It's a lot. We put it on 1 week, mainly for the preachers didn't want to preach on it twice.
The real reason.
There's the honesty, right? You gotta be honest. But it is also a rehashing of a lot of what we've read before, and so if you want, kind of jump around. I hope that this handout will be helpful for you to kind of pick parts to read. Don't feel like you need to read all of it in the next week. If you want to, go for it. I think Chronicles is a wonderful book, but it's one of these books that gets a lot of jabs because it is a repeat of what's become before. There are 9 chapters of genealogies that begin it. It's almost like the author's trying to get you not to read the book. It's like, oh, wait, all right, chapter 1? All right, well, we're done with genealogies. And it goes like that literally for 9 chapters. So it's not the easiest book to get going, but there's some wonderful stuff in it. What we're going to do today is I'm going to give a background on this, and then we're going to talk specifically about the role of the temple and worship in the book and how the book is dealing with that and how central that is to the book as a whole. I want to, well, I'm not going to pull it up. Let me just give a background and then we'll dig into the actual passages. So, 1st and 2nd Chronicles was most likely written in the 4th century. So if you remember from where we've come, right, at the end of Kings, Jerusalem falls, and it falls to the Babylonians. This is sometime in 587, 586 BC. After that, the majority of the Judites, of the folks that live in Judah and Jerusalem, are taken into Babylon. And they live there basically till 539, when Cyrus, the Persian king, defeats the Babylonians and sends them back. So in the next couple of weeks, we're going to read Ezra and Nehemiah, and that deals with this post-exilic people. So not the people in exile, but this kind of return from exile and the building of the second temple. What the chronicler is doing is the chronicler is a post-exilic person. He exists after this period, but he's telling the story before. He's basically telling the story, and this isn't a joke, from Adam all the way to the fall of Babylon. So he's covering literally everything we've already read in 2 books. It's a singular book. The Protestant Bible breaks it into 2. But that's what this book's dealing with. It's dealing with Adam. The book starts Adam with the genealogy and goes all the way to the fall of Babylon. And then actually it mentions Cyrus, this Persian king. And we'll talk about why he's important. Rob, Bill, a couple other people have mentioned the ordering in the Jewish Bible is different, and that's for a number of books. But Chronicles, which is a single book that's known as Divrei Hayamim, which is the events of the days or the matter of the days, it is at the very end of the Jewish Bible. So in the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, it ends. And the reason for that is the Hebrew Bible is covering this period that literally Chronicles recounts the entirety of it. And so they put it at the very end of the Bible, excuse me, they put it at the very end of the Bible as a kind of rehashing of what's already been told. In our Bibles, it happens after Kings, before Ezra and Nehemiah, and that's because that's essentially where it takes place historically. It's this period of catching you up to this point in the Persian period. And the Persian period is when the exiles return to Babylon and rebuild. So that's where it's placed. That's actually taken from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So we're basing our ordering off of that. A couple other things about it. It's going to tell the entire story of Israel from Adam, like I've said a million times, from Adam to the fall of Babylon, but it is going to focus predominantly, almost exclusively on Judah, not on Israel. So the kingdom divides into two, remember? With Jeroboam and Rehoboam, it splits. And Kings tells us both sides of the story, right? Kings tells us about Israel, and it tells us about Judah. Chronicles is just going to tell us about Judah. If it talks about Israel, it's typically in a bad sense. Israel failed to do this. Israel failed to do that. This is why Israel got conquered. This is why this happened. Its primary purpose is to tell the story of Judah. And the reasons for that are twofold. One, it sees the Davidic lineage as the only true lineage of kingship within Israel as a whole. So if you remember, Rehoboam is David's son, and Jeroboam is another person that breaks off to Israel. So when the kingdom splits, the Davidic line stays in the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom doesn't have that claim. And what Chronicles is saying is this is the true kingship of Israel. This is what God intended. The other second point is, does anyone have any guesses? What else does Judah have that Israel doesn't?
The temple.
The temple, yeah. That I was reading through this, and I was preparing all this, and I was just astounded at how central the temple is to these books. The Davidic kingship and the temple are the big things that are happening in Judah and are the focus of this book. And I would actually wager that you can almost read First and Second Chronicles through the lens of the temple and worship. It's almost like that's what it's telling. Why is the temple important to the audience of Chronicles, to the people reading it as it came out?
Because it's been destroyed.
Because it's been destroyed, they're rebuilding it, and they're trying to have life again, right? Y'all have to forgive me, my allergies have been crazy. When they return, Ezra and Nehemiah deal with the reality of returning. Remember, Jerusalem's completely wiped off the face of the earth. They come back and they have to rebuild life. They have to restore life. And what Chronicles is saying is this life has to center around the temple. What matters is the temple and proper worship. If we are to be successful, if we are to be in the good graces of God, if we are to be a kingdom amongst other kingdoms that rises above because we are unique, it is solely because of our relationship with God and how we carry out life in the temple, how we carry out worship in the temple. And so what Chronicles is and I think this is did any of y'all watch the video I sent out? They mentioned this too. They said it's a people telling it's something to this effect, that it's a people hearing their past to understand and kind of create their future. What the chronicler is doing is essentially saying, this is who you were. This is your identity. This is where you come from. This is the glory that used to be. And this is what can happen again. It's like if something's destroyed, you have to start over again. Where do you get the inspiration? Where do you get the hope? And so what they're doing is they're telling themselves the past to kind of build the hope, to build a sense of purpose, and to create a new future. And so that's what Chronicles is doing. And the reason it's doing it around the temple is because that's where their identity is. Their social identity, their religious identity, their cultural identity, just everything about them was grounded in the temple. When that was destroyed, it was like their identity was wiped off. And so the rebuilding of the temple and creating life again centers on the temple. Some other themes that you'll see is the Levites. The Levites are all over Chronicles, and that's because what do the Levites do?
They're priests.
They're priests, and they do the worship in the temple. They're responsible for everything. Some others is the nations. So the nations is just a word used to describe those around Israel. And so Israel's always had a contentious relationship with the nations. That comes up again and again in Chronicles. But also another theme you'll see is Israel being the centerpiece, this kind of messianic kingdom almost, where God's reign can be initiated through them, and God's sovereignty expanding beyond just Israel but to all peoples. So we'll see this in the prophets, right? The prophets talk about the other nations and not just Israel. That God is the God, not just of Israel, but of all nations. And that comes to a head point in Christ, right? Because Christ is the God, the Savior of all peoples and not just a specific people. And so you're seeing that wrestling with Israel, trying to say, who's our theological identity? Who is God the God of? And you're seeing in Chronicles that expanding. It's really neat as we come to the kind of second half of the Old Testament to pay attention to the story of Israel expanding beyond its bounds. Remember when we read through Deuteronomy, when we read through Numbers, when we read through Exodus, there's this language about the foreigner and taking care of the foreigner. So Israel has an ethical association beyond its own bounds. It's not just Israel that we're responsible for. We're responsible for the foreigner, for the aliens that live among us. And now we're seeing in these books this idea that God is not just the God of Israel, but the God of all nations. Now, it's not fully formulated in this text, but you'll begin to see it in some parts. I think that covers it for an introduction. Do y'all have any questions about Chronicles or just the overall what's going on here?
Yeah, before the class, we talked about the ending. And
Yeah.
I appreciate your comments. My question is, do you think it was not just a historical consideration in terms of where to put Chronicles, but also a theological one? In the Hebrew Bible, the end of the Hebrew Bible is in Chronicles talking about the decree of Cyrus.
Right.
And that Cyrus is going to be sending people back to Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the Septuagint and the Vulgate, that's been changed. Now, I agree, there's a historic reason for that. But my question is there also a theological one? Because what ends the Vulgate and what ends the Septuagint is the book of Malachi. I've got it right here. And it does not end on the decree of Cyrus coming back to Jerusalem. But what does it end on? Looking forward to the coming day of the Lord.
Yeah.
And the Messiah is coming. So it seems to me that that fortifies a Christological interpretation of the ordering of the books. So you can say, I can say as a Christian, because I believe in Christ as the Messiah, I can say, well, it's proven in the Old Testament because the Old Testament ends on expecting the day of the Lord.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's a pretty strong argument. However, it doesn't, you can't make that argument if you have the original Hebrew Bible. You can't make that argument because it ends not with Malachi and the day of the Lord, but it ends with Cyrus and the return to Jerusalem.
Right.
So I guess my question is, was it not just a historical reason that the Septuagint and the Vulgate did that, but was also an element of a theological reason so that we as Protestants could say, look how nicely the Old and New Testaments fit together.
Yeah.
You know, which is how I was raised, that the New Testament Matthew just fits right in to what Malachi prophesies.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing to bring up, and I think there's some veracity in what you're lifting up. I would say that the ordering is based off the Septuagint, which was initially Jewish folks that wrote that.
Yeah.
That put that together. And so that ordering is by Jewish folks.
Yeah.
So I think they're just playing with the order. I think as Christians we can read it that way. I don't know if that's historically what happened. The other point I would make is historically and theologically, the Bible's both, right? There is nothing that is just explicitly and only historical, and there's nothing that's explicitly and only theological, but these things are blending together. And so I think we can read a variety of things into it, a historical approach as well as a theological.
Yeah, for me, when I was in university, I was part of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which is an international organization working with students. And in that, we had a number of what I would call today fundamentalists that were very rational, and they would argue that, yeah, these prophecies, talk about Jesus Christ, and this is all like that. And the more I read, and the older I get, I accept more mystery than just this ironclad, thinking that A equals B and all of that.
Yeah,
And so I'm less judgmental toward my Jewish brothers and sisters.
Hmm.
Because I think within their own system, their system makes sense to them.
yeah. Well, I remember one time Rabbi Bernhold said that the text speaks beyond itself, so we can read it one way and y'all can read it the other. And at the same time, we can share these texts.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm
Yeah,
gonna,
thanks.
oh, go ahead, Bill.
I don't know if this relates to that or not, but one thing I'm doing is reading these books in the Message. I've never read all the way through, so that may shape. But an impression I had, I think it's Robert Adler who says in Chronicles, David's character in history gets airbrushed.
Yeah.
Bathsheba's left out and so forth.
There's a lot of stuff.
An
left out.
impression I have is, and that would rankle me, but I think the writer of Chronicles, it ends very interestingly with Cyrus speaking for God.
Yeah,
And it ends, at least in the New Revised Standard Version, let him go up with this. Adler, somebody says in Hebrew, it's an incomplete sentence.
yeah, it's not finished.
Yeah, so to me, it's trying to draw the best out of their history and say, this is what will impel it. I felt a little differently about the airbrushing because, not getting into politics right now, I hope the best of this nation
Yeah.
prevails and the desire for democracy and equality. In some ways, we are replicating the worst of times.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I forgot to mention that. So it's retelling the story, right? But it's not telling the whole story. Like, so Bill just lifted up, and if you haven't read through it, you'll see this, especially when you look at David. It doesn't tell all the bad stuff about David. Now, as modern readers, we probably say, oh, well, they're trying to hide all the warts. What's happening is Chronicles is written for a very specific purpose. People knew what Bathsheba. It's all over the Bible. It's not like they didn't know about that. They have access to Samuel. We have access to Samuel. They're not trying to hide something as much as to portray David almost in this messianic light. This is what the ideal king would look like. This is what we want. Chronicles is written future oriented. It's telling the past to orient them toward the future. And they want the future to be a very specific way. That's why they're not telling the bad stuff. It's not because they're trying to hide it, because it's not hidden. It's in Samuel. This author is pulling from Samuel, pulling from Kings, but he's telling a very specific story. I was thinking about this, and you can think about it in your own lives. Think about some time that something tragic has happened to you. You start re-narrating your life and trying to make sense of it. When you're in a bad place, what stories do you tell yourselves? The good stories, right? You're going to tell your things, well, I did this at one time, this happened. I picked myself up and I started over again. You're not going to kind of dwell on all the bad stuff that's happened. If you do, you're just going to tailspin into depression. And so what Chronicles is trying to do is trying to take the best from the tradition to orient them towards rebuilding and restoration. Now, it's easy to say, well, they're just trying to hide, David's sins. Well, they are hiding David's sins, but they're not doing it for this intention to like erase it from the record, because it's deeply within the record. I mean, think about Psalm 51 or all the stuff in Samuel. The point, though, is more like to carry them into the future, and they're going to do that through the good stories.
And that explains it ending the Hebrew Bible, pointing to the future and the messianic expectation.
Yeah.
It's going to be this kind of Messiah, not with the warts, but with the best that we can anticipate. And it emphasizes the covenant with David and the Davidic line. That's why you get Judah. You don't get the northern kingdom.
Right.
You get the southern kingdom. And it's going to grow out of that. And they're coming back from exile, Cyrus. We have the future to look forward to.
A new beginning.
Yeah.
A new beginning and stuff. So it's going to be the positive note.
Right.
Malachi, hell's going to handbasket.
Yeah.
We need a Messiah.
Yeah.
Because we're not doing what we should be doing.
Right.
So spin it either way, future oriented, we need the messianic hope. Either way.
Yeah. And there's a communal sense in Chronicles as well. This is Israel as a whole coming together. And we'll see that in Ezra and Nehemiah. So I'm going to pull up the handout, and if you are in class, you can look on. So another thing to lift up is, in this outline really quick, it is telling the story from Adam to the fall, but it's basically just telling the story of Solomon and David. The majority of this book is Solomon and David, and that is because it's going to just tell the building of the temple, David preparing for the building of the temple. And so it's telling the history of Israel, but it's really glossing over a lot. And it's really going to hone in on the kings, specifically David and Solomon. You see here, basically the ending of 2nd Chronicles, the second half, excuse me, covers the divided monarchy. And I've broken that down just to who they're covering. It's largely just going to say, did this king do good or did this king do bad? And good or bad is directed around, are they worshiping? Are they obedient? Are they faithful to Yahweh? Or are they disobedient? Are they lacking faithfulness? Martin?
I have a question. I get the timelines confused sometimes. When the temple was built and destroyed twice, was that correct?
Yes.
Now, the first time, did the Babylonians destroy the temple?
The Babylonians came into Jerusalem and eventually destroyed the temple. Yeah,
Okay.
They were there for a while before they did.
And Solomon rebuilt it.
No. Solomon built the original temple,
Okay.
and then hundreds of years later, the Babylonians came in.
Okay, gotcha.
Solomon's David's son, somewhere around 900 is Solomon, and the temple's around there. It's destroyed in 586, 587.
Okay, how about the Romans? When did they
70.
destroy it?
70 AD.
All right, those are the two.
Yep.
So it was you said it was a big symbol, so the Romans were pretty wise. They destroyed the symbol. And then the people.
Well, there was a revolt against the Romans. Yeah.
The people when they were in Babylon, when did they do the switch over? Because they were, the temple sort of held everybody. If the temple was there, that's where you had to worship God.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Messiah, that's the new way. You don't have to be in a building. Jesus brings you another way to do it. So when did all this occur? I thought.
Yeah, I don't want to go too far off in the weeds because I have like a million things I want to talk about in Chronicles. But temple worship isn't some kind of consistent thing that happened throughout history. It is, they're dipping in and out of it. There's worship happening far away from the temple, and the temple serves as a sense of identity throughout, and then it's destroyed, and that's when we see the Hebrew Bible come together. So a lot of it's written before, some of it's written after, but it's starting to be pulled together because all of a sudden these oral stories need to be written down. They see that things can be erased, and so they're trying to kind of have a concrete record of their story.
Well, and aren't there 2 second temples? Because you have Ezra and Nehemiah, the Jews come back and they build the second temple.
Right.
However, Herod also builds the second temple.
Yeah.
So, to me, it can be confusing when people talk about Jesus lived in the second temple period. And you read that because they count Herod's temple as the second temple.
Right.
When really what he's doing is making the temple of Ezra and Nehemiah better and more glorious, so it reflects Solomon. Is that how you see it?
Renovation.
Yeah, so sometimes it's confusing, which is the second temple, and I thought maybe Herod's is the third temple.
Well, I don't think you could call it a third temple.
No, but there's like a 600-year difference.
Yeah, it's a big time period, yeah.
Yeah. So
another thing to lift up in all this is think about the history of all these things, how far back it is, and yet the effect it's still having to this day. Think about how divisive life is in Israel. Think about this, Assyria comes into Israel in 722 and destroys it, pulls Jewish folks into Assyria. Those people become the Samaritans. Jesus is talking about that 700 something years later, right? These stories are so deeply alive to this day. even if they're not impacting us directly, here, these things are still happening. History is so alive. It's really boggled my mind as we've read through just how interconnected all these things are. Okay, let's go back to Chronicles. So I have in your handout, not a comprehensive, but a pretty detailed list of places where the temple or things related to the temple come up. So we're not going to go through all of this, but I'm going to point towards some of it. And I want you, as we're looking through this, to think about how is this speaking to an audience that is post-exile and trying to start life over again. What is the message here? Because it's like when Mark's telling Mark's gospel, he's telling it to a community that's most likely suffering, right? It's most likely around the destruction of the temple. Mark is telling a story that's happened in the past, but he's telling explicitly for a community in the present to help them orient toward the future, right? So these things are not told historically like we think of history, right? For us, history is just recounting something. There's an intentionality behind it, and I think you'll see as we go through this, the intentionality focusing around the temple and worship. So the first section is the genealogies. As I lifted up before, there's about 9 chapters of this. They're very detailed. It goes into great depth. It's connecting Israel's present all the way back to Adam. One thing to pay attention to is that all the tribes are listed, but the tribes of Benjamin, Judah, and the Levites are given more space than the other tribes. Why is that? Well, they're connected to the temple, but they're also the southern tribes, right? So the rest of the tribes are up north. So even in the genealogy, we're going to start seeing this focus on Judah. Chapter 9 does have a list of Babylonian exiles who return, and then it starts talking about the Levites and their priestly duties. From there, it's going to kind of go backward in history. And so if you see in 1 Chronicles 13, we start to hear about the ark being brought. Do y'all remember when David started dancing in front of the ark and brought it into Jerusalem? So it's retelling that story. I want you to jump to chapter 16, though. Let me pull this up for y'all at home.
Is this on the paperwork that you prepared for us?
Yeah, it's not, the verses aren't in there, but well, I should say the verse is there, but the words aren't. So if you go to 1 Chronicles 16, and if you look, it says at the very top, this is when the ark is placed in the tent or the tabernacle. So we are not with temple, right? The temple is not here yet. So the tabernacle is the house of the Lord. And it's the tabernacle they've carried through the desert, right? And then you go to verse 7, and there's this psalm that David gives. You'll see psalms, literal psalms that we have in our book of Psalms, quoted almost in full throughout Chronicles. They're the psalms that are associated with David, and Chronicles is bringing those into the book. Chronicles borrows from Kings and Samuel, but it also borrows from the prophets, from Judges, from Deuteronomistic history, which is that long period from Joshua to Kings, and the Psalms and the prophets. So it's pulling from a lot of places. But I want you to go to 1634. Donna, would you read 1634?
Sure. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his steadfast love endures forever.
Okay, so this is going to be a refrain we're going to see throughout Chronicles. It appears at least in 2 other places, and it's telling us 2 things. God is good, and his steadfast love endures forever. So there's kind of different ways to read that. One is following God, being good, God will be good to you. The other is the Davidic Covenant, right? Endures forever, and God's steadfast love will be with the house of Judah, with the house of David forever. So you'll see this in very key places in 2 Chronicles 5:13 and 2 Chronicles 7:3 as a refrain when they're building the temple, right? So God is good. God is keeping us through. So you'll see this over and over again, so pay attention to it. So I want to jump now to chapter 17. And we're gonna, gosh, there's so much stuff to read. Oh, do y'all have the ability to stay here till about 5 p.m.?
We're bringing lunch.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
The race started at 1:30.
Uh-oh. All right, well, let me read just some parts of this. Let's go down. So this is the Davidic covenant that God makes with David. So if you remember from 2 Samuel chapter 7, this is where the Davidic covenant is. And if you remember when I was teaching that, I was saying this is one of the most pivotal places in all of the Old Testament. And that's because God is making a covenant with David that his lineage would continue forever, right? And we trace that to Christ. We can trace that to a bunch of things all through the monarchy, etc. But it's a really pivotal point. That's happening here. There's an additional point. So if you jump down to verse 10, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will subdue your enemies. That's not what is the matter. Let's read this next verse. Moreover, I declare to you that the Lord will build you a house. When your days are fulfilled to go with your ancestors, I will raise up offspring for you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. That's God speaking to David about Solomon. Now listen to this, verse 12. He shall build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. Temple, Davidic line continues forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from him who was before you, Saul. But I will confirm in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words and all the vision, Nathan spoke to David. So Nathan's speaking on behalf of God to David about the Davidic covenant and that Solomon will build the temple. Now, if you're hearing this as a reader in the post-exile, restoration, building the temple, we're doing what's being spoken of, right? So they're identifying here. There's just like so many layers to this and so much richness to this. And Chronicles is telling this story, focusing it on the temple, telling it to this people that's going to rebuild it. So let's jump now to chapter 21. So we hear the Davidic covenant. Now, does anyone remember or know why David, according to Chronicles, doesn't build the house of the Lord?
Because God tells him he's not going to.
Well, he tells him he's not going to, but do we know a reason why?
Because he was a warrior.
Because of his sins, because of his warriors, right? So if you jump, well, we'll look at it in a second, because there's a place where it mentions it explicitly. But in 21, if you've got your Bibles open, and I've got it pulled up on the screen as well, let me make this a little bigger for y'all at home. So there's a census that happens, a plague, but I want you to jump down to 18. Bill Hull, would you read 18 through 22?
Of chapter 21
Yes, please.
through 22.
Yeah, 18 through 22.
Then the angel of the Lord commanded Gad to tell David that he should go up and erect an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So David went up following Gad's instructions, which he had spoken in the name of the Lord. Ornan turned and saw the angel, and while his 4 sons were with him, hid themselves. Ornan continued to thresh wheat. As David came to Ornan looked and saw David. He went out from the threshing floor and did obeisance to David with his face to the ground. David said to Ornan, "Give me the site of the threshing floor, that I may build on it an altar to the Lord. Give it to me at its full price, so that the plague may be averted from the people."
So this is where the temple will be built, and David's going to purchase it from Ornan. And now if you jump down to 28, Eileen, would you read 28 through 30?
At that time, when David saw that the Lord had answered him at the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, he made his sacrifices there. For the tabernacle of the Lord, which Moses had made in the wilderness, and the altar of burnt offering were at that time in the high place of Gibeon. But David could not go before it to inquire of God, for he was afraid of the sword of the angel of the Lord.
So what's happening here is David makes a sacrifice, he puts an altar, he purchases this land, and this is where the temple will be built. One thing to notice about Chronicles is David is way more involved in the temple in Chronicles than he is in Samuel. And the story is way more expanded. The temple story is literally the end of Chronicles 1, going into Chronicles 2. It expands, it takes up so much space. But again, I'm saying this over and over again, but the temple is so central to this story. And so the story spends an inordinate amount of time on it. And there's a lot about David that we don't get in Samuel in regards to the temple. So I want you to jump now to chapter 22. So 22 begins, then David said, here shall be the house of the Lord God, and here the altar of the burnt offering for Israel. So David has been told, you're not going to build my altar. But Chronicles is making it very clear that David kind of helped build the altar. So Chuck, would you read 2 through 5?
2 through 5.
Yes, please.
So David gave orders to call together the foreigners living in Israel, and he assigned them the task of preparing finished stone for building the temple of God. David provided large amounts of iron for nails that would be needed for the doors and the gates, and for clamps that he gave more bronze than could be weighed. He also provided innumerable cedar logs for men of Tyre and Sidon, and brought vast amounts of cedar to David. David said, my son Solomon is still young and inexperienced, and since the temple to be built for the Lord must be a magnificent structure, the famous and glorious throughout the world, I will begin making preparations for it now. So David collected vast amounts of building materials before his death.
Thanks. So David is not building the temple, but he kind of is, right? Remember, David is the ideal king in the chronicler's eyes. And so the chronicler is kind of changing history or adding some detail into it to make David more involved in the building of the temple than he was in Samuel. There's various reasons for this, but I would say probably the predominant one is the chronicler is trying to make David the ideal king in any way he can. And so he's attaching him to the temple, even though God says you're not building the temple. He's not going to build it, but he's going to do tons of preparations, provide innumerable cedar, unweighable amounts of bronze. You know, David's doing a lot here. So if you have your handout, and I'll share this with y'all at home, I want you to look at that part where it says David prepares for the temple's construction. It's on the third page. So y'all find it? So there's 3 parts that are put in bold. So we read the top part, 22, 2 through 5. Those bold parts are speeches David gives. So in the first one, which is 5 through 16, David is going to address Solomon directly. And who's got their Bible in front of them and can just read verses 8 and 9?
I'm 22?
Yes, please.
I can.
All right. Thanks,
I think I
Richard.
have it right here. But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, you have shed much blood and have waged great war. You shall not build a house in my name, because you have shed so much blood in my sight on the earth. See, a son shall be born to you. He shall be a man of peace. I'll give him peace from all his enemies on every side, for his name shall be Solomon, and I will give peace and quiet to Israel in his days.
So there we go. We get the explanation why David is not going to build the temple and why Solomon is. David's essentially the one that kind of builds up the kingdom and prepares everything. Solomon is the one who kind of rests on David's laurels and can do the work of building a temple and not worry about waging war. Solomon's name is a derivation of the Hebrew word peace, right? Shalom. So he's a man of peace. He has the prosperity and the peacefulness to build this temple. So that's the first speech that David gives. The second one happens in chapter 28, and David delivers essentially the same speech, but he's delivering it to all of Israel. He's retelling this speech again. And then in chapter 29, David delivers another speech, let's go to that. I'm going to pull that up. If you have your Bible, let's jump to chapter 29. Because I think this is it's helpful to read after what we just read. That's not okay. Hold on. I have all this stuff pulled up, but I did not pull this. Okay. All right. So I want you to go down. Well, we'll read just verse. Look what I'm doing. I pulled up 2 Chronicles. Okay. So this is the third of David's speeches around the temple, and I want you to just listen to what he says. King David said to the whole assembly, "My son Solomon, whom alone God has chosen, is young and inexperienced, and the work is great, for the temple will not be for mortals, but for the Lord God. So I have provided for the house of my God, so far as I was able, the gold for the things of gold, the silver for the things of silver, and the bronze for the things of bronze, the iron for the things of iron, and the wood for the things of wood, besides great quantities of onyx and stones for setting, antimony, colored stones, all sorts of precious stones, and marbles in abundance. Moreover, in addition to all that I have provided for the holy house, I have a treasure of my own of gold and silver, and because of my devotion to the house of my God, I give it to the house of my God." Do you hear what he's listing? This is what we already heard about, right? About David gave all these things. Now I want you to listen to this. Jump to verse 5, and here I'll read 4. 3,000 talents of gold, of the gold of Ophir, and 7,000 talents of refined silver for overlaying the walls of the house. Now listen to this. And for all the work to be done by the artisans, gold for the things of gold and silver for the things of silver. Who then will offer willingly, consecrating themselves today to the Lord? David's saying, hey, I did all this. What are you guys going to do? Right? Now think about if you're reading this. You're in this period, the temple's most likely been rebuilt, but this is calling you to do what? To participate in this work, right? If you're hearing this, it's almost a call to you. It's David speaking through the centuries. Hey, look what I did. Look what all these people did before you. All right, now it's your turn. Get to work, right? It's like an Acts when they see the angels after the Lord ascends, and the angel's like, what the heck are y'all doing looking up? Right? Get to work. There's work to be done, right? Go spread the word. This is a message not only to the people in the story, but to those reading it as well. Those are the things to kind of pay attention to as you're reading it. There's multi-layers to this. It's speaking in a variety of ways, and it's interesting to see how it does that. So after this, there's this period of basically 4 chapters that talk about the Levites, what the Levites do, who the Levites are, what their roles are, what they're going to do in the temple, who are going to be the musicians. It's just a long, long list. And then finally we come to 2 Chronicles, and chapters 2 through 7 detail Solomon building the temple. We've been hearing about it for a while. We've been hearing about all the preparations, all the work that goes into it. David's 3 speeches about it, why he's building, or why Solomon's building and not him. And finally, we come to that work. So I want you to jump to 2 Chronicles 5. And what we're seeing is the ark is brought into the temple here. Again, we saw the ark being brought into Jerusalem. Solomon's repeating that, except now it's being brought into the temple. And I want you to jump to verse 13. And Barbara, would you read 13 from chapter 5?
And it was the duty of the trumpeters and the singers to make themselves heard in unison and praise and thanksgiving to the Lord. And when the song was raised with trumpets and cymbals and other musical instruments in praise to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. And the house of the Lord was filled with a cloud, so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled the house of God.
Thanks. So we're seeing the ark being brought into the temple. They're repeating this refrain that I pointed to that's in 1 Chronicles 16:34. It's connecting back to David. It's this psalm that David sings. Now the people are singing it. And what happens afterwards?
God comes into the temple.
Right, God comes in the temple. The glory of the Lord appears upon over the ark. And that's what happens when they're in the desert. It's what happens when they wander through the desert. It's this God is present, God is here, right? The Lord is good. His steadfast love endures forever. So we can jump then to 7. So this is when Solomon dedicates the temple. And if we'll go to 7:3, well, I'll just read the first 3 verses. When Solomon had ended his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The priest could not enter the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. When all the people of Israel saw the fire coming down and the glory of the Lord on the temple, they bowed down on the pavement with their faces to the ground and worshipped and gave thanks to the Lord. Let's all say it, saying, "For he is good. His steadfast love endures forever." Right? So this refrain's coming up over and over again. And where is it coming up? In the temple, right? And what's happening? God is present. This is the message. Obey God, worship God in the temple in Jerusalem, and things will be good. Because God is good and his steadfast love endures forever. So that basically is all that's happening regarding the temple. Oh gosh, well, we don't have much time. All right, I'm going to point out 2 quick things. So if you go down to verse 12 of the same chapter, 2 Chronicles 7, there is this speech that God gives after Solomon dedicates the temple. A lot of commentators have said this is almost explicitly written to the people reading Chronicles. So it's a speech God gives to Solomon, but it's speaking again to the people. He's like, look at verse 13. When I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command the locusts to devour the land, or send pestilence among my people, if my people who are called by my name humble themselves, pray, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal the land. So this is God speaking to Solomon. It's also God speaking to the post-exilic community. If you do this, things will be good. I will be with you. And then if you jump down to verse 19, but if you turn aside and forsake my statutes and my commandments that I've set before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, this will happen. It's like the end of Deuteronomy. It's like what we see in Judges. It's like what happens in Kings. You do this, things are good. You do this, things are bad. That's how the Psalms begin, right? Psalm 1 starts us off on this. So this is all, we're seeing these same things over and over again. So I'm going to pull up the handout because we cannot keep reading, unfortunately. But I want to just share a couple quick things. So after Solomon, the kingdom divides. His son Rehoboam is in the south, and Jeroboam starts the kingdom in the north. This happens in chapter 12, I believe, of Kings, 1 Kings. But you'll see here, there's just all these things that I've listed for you that you can kind of jump around if you want. But it's basically, are the kings following God? Or are they not? And if they're not following God, they're going to get invaded. They're going to have bad things happen to them. If they follow God, like Hezekiah or Josiah, things typically go well. And this all revolves kind of around the temple. So look at the first one. Shemaiah declares judgment against Rehoboam for abandoning the Lord. And then right after this, Ahijah, who's a king of Judah, delivers a speech to Jeroboam in Israel. And he's telling them, hey, come back. True worship happens in Jerusalem. The Davidic line is the real line. So you're seeing him kind of articulate what the chroniclers has been trying to tell. And then I want you to jump to your Bibles. I promise this is the end. I promise. Let's look at chapter 2 Chronicles 36. This is the very end. So all this bad stuff has happened. We're at the very end of the monarchy. Israel has already fallen. Judah now falls to Babylon. There's exile. And then verse 22. Now you have to remember there's hundreds of years that have happened between, right? It falls in 587, 586. Cyrus comes around 539. Not hundreds of years, I meant decades. So decades have passed, and now we read this. In the first year of the king Cyrus of Persia, in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. So we have prophet, we have God. The Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia. Again, God is the God of all nations, not just Israel. So that he sent a herald throughout all his kingdom and also declared in a written edict. Now imagine you're reading this. This is the very last verse of the entire Hebrew Bible. Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up. So if you're reading this, it's like it's come all the way to you now. And now exiles happen, or exile's over, the rebuilding of the temples happened, and here we are. And it's trying to tell you a couple of things. Restoration is happening. God is the God of all nations. God is good. The Davidic line will continue in some shape, form, or fashion, and you're going to be part of it. It ends with this, as Bill mentioned, a fragment. It's not a full sentence. It's like Mark's gospel, the initial ending is just an empty tomb.
And it's a foreign king delivering this message.
Yeah.
There's an ending note for you.
Right. God is the God of all nations, and God will work through whatever purposes God needs to. Chronicles is a great book. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Let me say a prayer. Gracious, holy, loving God, we give you thanks for this day and this chance to gather as your people around your word. We're so grateful for this opportunity to spend a year reading through your Bible, and we just pray that you continue to be with us as we read about your presence to your people and your steadfast love, which endures forever. We ask all these things in your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, thank y'all. Ezra and Nehemiah is next week, and I believe Marsha Ryberg will be leading.
Okay, thank you, Will.
Thank y'all.
Isn't Cyrus called